Jesus says this. In the 6th chapter of Luke's Gospel, continuing in what we call the Sermon on the Plain, where Jesus gives the core of his teaching to a crowd of people listening from around in Judea and Samaria and outsider territory as well. He says this, "But I say to you that listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemy. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful." You know, there's a line from the famous French writer Voltaire who says, "In the beginning, we were made in God's image, and ever since, human beings have been trying to return the favor." Ever since, you could say, ever since Genesis 1, we've been trying to remake God in our own image. And to be very honest, what we imagine God to be like is quite often a powerful indicator of how we want to have permission to act in the world. So it makes a really big difference how you picture what God is like. The way you envision how God is says an awful lot about what you think is permissible for you to do to other people. After all, how many terrible atrocities have been committed in human history, all in the name of, well, my God does the same kind of thing, so I'm allowed to do it. That's what God is like, I'm allowed to do it. Or how many times have we turned away, ignoring somebody's need because we were convinced they didn't really matter to God either, or that God's approach was kind of hands-off. I don't get involved in stuff like that. This is, to be very honest, I think why theology, our way of talking about God, is so absolutely, imminently practical and can be a matter of life and death. Bad theology kills. It absolutely does. And good theology has a way of making all the difference in the world. Not to sound defensive, when I was in high school and classmates of mine all knew that Steve thought he was going to go off and study theology one day, the joke used to be, I see you're going to go work in a religion factory somewhere, because it seemed like it was just absolutely useless information to study. And to be fair, sometimes theology has earned that reputation, that we're just a bunch of people guessing and talking about the invisible realities that nobody can prove or test or dissect in a lab, and that for some instances makes absolutely no difference in our lives. Medieval theologians famously debated how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, and everybody else asks, why does that matter? There are plagues and wars and famines going on around. Why are we debating that kind of thing? There have been questions like, what was God doing before God invented the universe? Well, wait a second, there are problems right here in the here and now. Why are we navel-gazing about what God's doing, right? It can seem sometimes like theology is useless, like we're all just guessing and talking about stuff we can't see or prove or really understand anyway, right? Except what we believe about God comes back to tell us what things we can do toward one another. How we live in the world is very much shaped by what we believe matters in the long run. And if you're convinced that God is a part of that reality, if we're convinced that God is the really real, then yeah, we're going to take our cues for how we live, how we treat other people based on what we think God is like. And all throughout human history, we've been playing this game of imagining cruel gods to justify our own cruelty to each other, right? The Greeks and the Romans imagined basically indifferent, apathetic gods who were sometimes just crude and capricious and bloodthirsty and would come and mess with human beings. And therefore, it doesn't surprise us that the Roman Empire's understanding of might makes right. If you've got the power, you can do what you want. After all, that's how the gods do things. Zeus and Apollo, or Jove and Jupiter and all the other gods and goddesses, they do whatever they like because they've got the power. And therefore, that's how it is for human beings, right? You've got the power, you can do what you want. The way you picture your God tells you an awful lot about what you're convinced you can do in the world. We have a way, like Voltaire said, of remaking God in our own image, basically as a way of giving ourselves permission to do what we think we want. The ancient gods and goddesses of ancient Israel's neighbors, the Canaanites, the Babylonians, all those kinds of things, they imagined basically the same, that the gods were power-hungry, battle-hardened warriors, and that the way to deal with your enemies was you killed them, and if you defeated your enemies, you were more powerful than them. And if that's how the gods worked, well, of course, that's how empires and nations and people work as well. Jesus assumes that what we think about God and about who God is, comes back and shapes how we live in the world. The critical difference is Jesus helps us to see that God isn't just a bloodthirsty warrior, in fact, never has been, but that the heart of God, throughout time immemorial, from Genesis 1 on, despite the ways we've gotten it wrong, the heart of God has always been one of love, even toward God's enemies. This is the radical break over against the gods and goddesses of the Roman Empire and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and, my goodness, Pharaoh's Egypt and his pantheon of capricious gods and goddesses as well. Jesus says the hallmark of God's own character, the real one living God, the creator of the universe, is God has made a world where good things are given even to stinkers. Jesus' way sharpens it even more. God is merciful to the ungrateful and the wicked, as well as to the well-behaved and the nice people as well. But my goodness, there's the bar. God is compassionate. God is good. God seeks the well-being even of people who want nothing to do with God, hate God, and are dead set turned away against God. And so Jesus says, therefore, if that's the beating heart of God, if that's who God is, then our actions will show up in the same vein as well. That's why Jesus says we are called to love our enemies as well. It doesn't mean I have to like what they do. It doesn't mean I have to personally like them either. To love is not primarily an emotion where I feel warm and fuzzy where my enemies walk into the room. It's about the commitment to do good even to people who have been rotten to us. It's about breaking the cycle of violence and hatred and vengeance and saying it doesn't matter anymore what you did to me. I won't let that define our relationship anymore. After all, that's how God operates. God doesn't base our relationship based on my previous stinkiness. God doesn't base my relationship with God based on all the times I've been rotten or mean or angry or cruel. God consistently starts over with me and is kind when I'm the one who is ungrateful and wicked. God has loved me when I was an enemy. And even on the days still, when I turn away from the good way of God and go off to do my own selfish thing, God doesn't give up on me. If that's how God is, that's how we are called to be present in the world. Not answering evil for evil or punch with punch or army with army or force with force. That ain't how we do things, because that's not how God does things. Jesus hangs it all on that everything comes down to the beating heart of God. How does God engage with the world? God loves even us at our worst, even when we have made ourselves God's enemies, even when we ourselves are ungrateful and wicked. God continues to love, and not to zap, not to force, not to bully. That's the beating heart of who God is, and therefore we are called to be people who love even our enemies, who are kind and who do good even to people who have been nothing but mean to us as well, who break the cycle of revenge. And we do it not because we're convinced it's always going to work or come out in our favor. There are sometimes wonderful, beautiful, shining moments where history shows us evidence of success when you approach a nonviolent way of responding to your enemies. My goodness, how beautiful to see the march at Selma. How beautiful to see the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the nonviolent protesters of the civil rights movement back in the 1960s creating change. It took an awful long time. But things like that happen. But we don't do it because it always gets results right away. Sometimes it takes a very, very long time. And sometimes there will be folks who argue and say it's just not productive, it's just not practical. You got to fight fire with fire. You got to beat up the other side and show them you mean business. You got to be strong and tough. And here's Jesus saying, what if you didn't have to prove toughness or strongness to anybody? Instead, what if we grounded our actions in what we believe about who God is? If we are convinced God's deepest core characteristic is love, even for stinkers, love even for us at our worst, the word for that is grace. If that's who God is, then we're going to be called to people who live that way toward others around us. The way God is and the way we act toward other people turn out to be two sides of the same coin. That's what Jesus shows us today. Jesus doesn't just give us a bunch of rules and say, follow these rules, and by the way, if you do well on them, a God who doesn't follow those rules will reward you. Jesus says, start with who God is. Love, absolute, reckless, audacious, suffering love that is willing even to bear love for the enemy. If that's who God is, then yep, that's what we're called to be in the world. Part of our calling, then, is to resist the temptation Voltaire talked about. That we don't keep remaking God over to give us permission to be mean so that we can be mean. We don't say, well, let's make God to be a bully so that now I've got permission to be a bully. Let's make God indifferent to the needs of others so that I've got permission to do that. But instead to take God as Jesus shows us, God's human face. The one who loves even all the way to a cross. The one who loves and dies breathing, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. The one who gives up his life in love to love his own enemies, you and me and a whole world full of us stinkers. If that's what God's beating heart is like in Jesus, that's what our calling is as well. That changes everything. And it is honestly the best news there is to be heard. Join us this Sunday for that conversation about how we take a look at who God is and who we are as two sides of the one same coin. See you Sunday.